The Steam Deck from Valve is the latest attempt at doing the near impossible, making a great handheld gaming PC. It kind of looks like a Nintendo Switch. It's definitely not a Nintendo Switch, but more importantly, I'm going to tell you whether or not you should buy one. Now, the Steam Deck is easily the most buzzworthy piece of new gaming hardware this year so far, and I have to say, as a device, it's very hard to review because the platform is still evolving. I've spent the past 2 weeks with the pre-release version of the Steam Deck, and even during that time, there have been a lot of software changes that affect how the device works and how you interface with your Steam library. Now, as PC gamers, you're probably used to this, doing some tweaking, doing some troubleshooting, figuring out how to get things to work the way you want them to, and that's all part of the Steam Deck experience. I think my big takeaway is, if you're the kind of person who hopped online and pre-ordered the Steam Deck last year during the very short window when it was available to pre-order, then you're probably going to be largely impressed and maybe a little irritated. If you're the kind of person who's looking for something that's kind of a cool, casual, pick-up-and-play handheld device like a Nintendo Switch and you don't have to worry about anything, this is probably not for you. Taking the openness and scope and scale of PC gaming and putting it in a handheld package, that's been kind of a holy grail for hardware makers for a long time. I can go all the way back to 2013, and Razer had something called the Edge that was a gaming Windows tablet with add-on controller-style paddles on the side. And we've seen other prototypes over the years. At CES a couple years ago, a few companies had handheld gaming prototypes that didn't really go anywhere. The Steam Deck is kind of like those, except for it's actually here and it actually works. However, this is not a Windows handheld gaming device. It runs SteamOS, which Steam originally came up with for Steam boxes, which were simple, small form factor gaming PCs that were intended to be an alternative to having a Windows-based gaming PC. Now, the original problem with SteamOS was that it ran Linux versions of games in your Steam library, so the game in your Steam library had to have a Linux version of it, which some did, but many did not. In the version on the Steam Deck, there's a helper app basically called Proton that works kind of like how Rosetta works for Macs when it's trying to take an app that was written for an Intel Mac and run it on an M1 Mac. So you can take any Windows-based Steam games and see if they'll run. In a lot of cases they do, even if they don't have an explicit Linux version, and that makes the entire thing a lot easier to just pick up and pick games out of your library and install. And some of them are verified by Valve, which means they're going to work really well, and some of them are the kind of, we think they're sort of going to work. We have some people who say they work, there's some questions about it, but most of the games I ran into just had a question mark, and that just meant they didn't have enough information yet to make a call about whether or not this was a good for Steam Deck game. So when I was testing the Steam Deck, I installed some of the verified games that I knew would work well. I installed a bunch of the exclamation point games that some gamers said worked well and maybe need some tweaks and some workarounds to get to, work perfectly. And I installed a whole bunch of the question mark games, some of which worked fine and some of which didn't. I got one of my favorite recent games, Inscription, to run, but I had to go into the properties for the game and find a checkbox for forcing compatibility, but then I got that to run. I couldn't get Halo Infinite to run. That seems like one you'd really want to play on this. By the time the Steam Deck launches, I'm hoping there's more comprehensive information for a much larger set of games in the Steam library. Now, the Steam Deck comes in 3 iterations. It's all the same hardware, but inside you can get a 64 gig storage version, that's $399. There's a 256 for $529, and there's a 512 gigabyte version for $650. That middle one, the 256, is the one I think most people would probably be interested in. Decent amount of storage, decent price. The 64 gig version, you're just not going to have enough room for any games. Frankly, I ran out of room almost immediately on the 256 version. I added another 256 as a micro SD card because there's a micro SD card slot and you can just put in a card there and get a ton of extra storage. I filled that second one up immediately, so I'm already deleting and reinstalling games and swapping them out because, frankly, a lot of games take 80, 100 gigs of space these days. You're going to eat up that 256 very quickly, and the 64, I don't even know how you get started with that. Now, you're looking at the device and you might say, yeah, it does seem kind of like a Nintendo Switch, obviously bigger and thicker, with a lot of buttons on it. So when I first took the Steam Deck and I showed it to my very game-savvy 10-year-old, his first comment was, it looks old. And I can see that. This has kind of a first-generation hardware look. It's big, it's chunky, it's kind of heavy, but there is a lot of stuff packed inside this box, so, you know, that makes sense. You've got traditional 2 analog sticks here, you've got the 4 face buttons, you've got a directional pad, you've got basically the start and select menu buttons, whatever they call them on whatever kind of controller you're used to using. There are 2 touchpads, which are really interesting, one on the left, one on the right, and they both have some level of haptics below them so you can get some feedback through there. There's a couple of menu buttons that I found a little confusing. There's a Steam button over here that brings up one subset of menus, and then there's a quick launch button over here that brings up a whole different set of sub-menus, so whether something goes in this side of it or that side of it seems a little arbitrary to me. And of course, around the back you've got triggers and bumpers, that's pretty standard, but also got 4 little paddle controllers right under where your fingers are going to be. You can use those paddles and assign specific key presses to them. You can say, like, if I need to access the I key in a PC game to get to my inventory, I can just map that to one of those back paddles or something similar. Now, the screen is a 7-inch touchscreen display. If you get the most expensive version, the 512 version, it's got some anti-glare etching on the glass, kind of like some high-end iMacs do, and I think one of the Apple monitors has the same thing as an option. I don't have that here, I just have the regular glary version, but it's fine. Inside the Steam Deck, you've got an AMD APU. That means it's the CPU and the GPU together. It's actually very similar conceptually to what's in the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series X, both of which use AMD chips that are, again, conceptually the same, although more powerful in those cases in most ways. That said, I was able to run a lot of brand new games on the Steam Deck at 60 frames per second and reasonably, medium to high detail levels. One of the reasons I'm able to do that is, frankly, the resolution on this guy, the screen resolution, is 1280 by 800. On a game console in your living room, maybe even on your gaming laptop, you're trying to push 4K resolution. There's really a lot you can get away with by knocking things down to 1280 by 800. On the 7-inch screen, it looked fine. I was able to actually output this to a bigger monitor screen. I could also hook up a keyboard and mouse via Bluetooth, and I was actually able to play some games just regular keyboard and mouse on a monitor style, but that's where you really see that low resolution. When you blow it up, it becomes more obvious. And no matter what, you can tell this thing is working because the fans are usually cranking pretty loud and there's a really steady stream of, frankly, pretty hot air blowing out from the front here. There's a little random fan noise for you. So I tried a whole bunch of games from my Steam library. Some of them worked fine, some of them didn't work, some of them worked, but the controls were just way too wonky, translating keyboard and mouse controls onto gamepad style controls. And some of them worked after I did some behind the scenes tweaking. For instance, I was able to play Horizon Zero Dawn, God of War, Shadow of the Tomb Raider. These are all very mainstream games that have very nice Steam versions. Horizon Zero Dawn and Shadow of the Tomb Raider both have benchmarks built in that actually ran, so I was able to try some different detail settings and run those benchmarks over and over again to see what kind of frame rates we got. In Horizon Zero Dawn, again, we're running at 1280 by 800 resolution. Lower detail settings, I got 48 frames per second. At higher detail settings, I got 33 frames per second. But a lot of the games I ran, frankly, hit in the 50s and 60s pretty easily. And if you go into the side menu using the 3-dot menu button on the right side of the Steam Deck, you can turn on an on-screen overlay that shows you frame rate and how much power it's using and what the CPU and GPU are doing. There's actually different levels. You can have a bigger one with more detail, a smaller one with less detail. It covers up a nice chunk of the screen, but if you want to check how the performance is doing at any particular game at any particular set of settings, you can turn that on and look at it and then go back and turn it off. Now, of course, a big question you're going to ask is about battery life. I think Valve had said something like 4 hours for some games, maybe a little more for other games. Okay, I went and played one of the games that I thought actually came off the best on this Steam Deck. I just randomly pulled up No Man's Sky, which I don't think I'd really played much since it first came out years ago. Always seemed sort of tedious to me. But frankly, it was right at home in this handheld format. It was actually great. And I loaded up the game and I played it from the battery was 100% to literally it shut down because the battery ran out of power. And that was about 2 hours. It also took me, using the included charger, about 2 hours to go from 0% up to 100% of the battery. It charges through regular USB-C. You can use your MacBook charger on it if you wanted to. Now, you're not stuck just in the Steam interface. You can actually go to the desktop mode, which is basically a Linux desktop. You kind of have to know what you're doing there. But the Firefox is built in. I was able to download and install Chrome right away. And doing that, I could run our regular video streaming battery test, the same one that we use on laptops and tablets. And with the same brightness and volume settings, I actually got it to run for 7 hours just streaming video. So the battery life is very variable. You're playing an intense game, you're going to get 2 hours. You're just watching video, you're going to get 7 hours. I eventually got the GOG, the good old game store, to run, was able to install and play at least a couple of older games from that. And I think once this Steam Deck is in wider release, you're going to see a lot of people figuring out how to get different games, not just Steam games, running on there. And even if it's a Windows game, not a Linux game, the same Proton emulation software is going to help you out there and try to run those games. It's interesting, using this, unlike a Nintendo Switch, there's no kickstand in the back. I think Valve is going to sell a sold separately stand, but I kept trying to hook up a keyboard and mouse to it or just look at it, and it kept falling over, so I actually went and I made a stand. I found a set of plans for an iPad stand, I think, and I tweaked them and I measured the thickness of the Steam Deck and I made my own stand. I made one out of wood on a laser cutter, made a couple of tweaks, and then made the final version out of lucite. And you can see that here, and I'm going to put the files up on Thingiverse and a link to it if you want to download it and make your own if you have a laser cutter. Most interesting to me was probably taking games that are clearly not intended for an Xbox-style controller, games that are keyboard and mouse only, and getting them to run. That's something Valve tried to solve for with the Steam controller from many years ago, where it had 2 touchpads built into something that looked like a regular game controller. So here you have the touchpads again. I tried Pathfinder: Wrath of the Righteous, which is a very traditional computer role-playing game, keyboard and mouse only, and frankly, the controls mapped pretty well. I was able to use the touchpad fairly easily. The text on the screen is still going to be small. You're thinking of a game that's really intended for a 15 or 17-inch screen. I did the same thing for Gloomhaven, which is the PC game adaptation of the gigantic tabletop board game. Again, keyboard and mouse game, also worked really well on the Steam Deck. I was pleasantly surprised by that. So part of the fun of playing with the Steam Deck for the last couple of weeks is discovering what worked, what didn't work, what workarounds I can come up with, which games are being added to the compatibility lists, what games didn't work last week but are working this week. So I find all that fascinating, and I think you will too if you're into that sort of troubleshooting and tweaking. The best analogy I can think of is I liken the Steam Deck to something like the first generation of modern consumer VR, the Oculus Rift, the HTC Vive. Technically, these were consumer products you could go out and buy, but they required a certain adventurous spirit where you knew it just wasn't going to be turn it on, plug and play, you're going. You knew there was going to be a learning curve and you were going to have to figure stuff out as you went. And for a lot of people, that's part of the fun. If you want to read my entire super in-depth hands-on review of the Steam Deck and see all the benchmarks and everything else, you can find the link in the description down below.